Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 10-Minute Talks, the first of our 2 episodes of 10-Minute Talks. And all I want to say is a quick welcome. We're delighted you're here, and we're going to move right into things. Our first 10-minute talker is Barbara Underwood. Barbara is currently Solicitor General of New York State, a post she has held since 2007. In 2018, she was selected by the state legislature to fill an unexpected vacancy as New York's 66th Attorney General, the first woman to hold that position. She did not run for re-election and was reappointed as Solicitor General by the newly elected AG. Earlier, she served as Principal Deputy and then Acting Solicitor General of the United States, the first woman to head that office. Before all that, she was a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, a tenured professor of law at Yale, and a prosecutor at both the federal and local levels. She's married to playwright and composer Martin Halpern, and she's the mother of actor Bobby Underwood, who recently finished a run as the constable in a well-received off-Broadway production of Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish. Welcome, my fellow Comstockian, Barbara Underwood.
So when the New York Attorney General suddenly resigned in 2018, I'd been a top advisor to at least 8 different leaders of major government law offices, and I knew the job of Attorney General quite well. I was confident that as the next in line, I could step into the job and keep the momentum going in the everyday work of the office, and also in a series of important cases where we were leading multi-state coalitions challenging federal executive actions in immigration, women's reproductive rights, the environment, and a host of other areas. I thought there wouldn't be any surprises, and I assured the legislature that that was so because I already knew the cases, the people working on them, and the issues we expected to encounter. But there were 2 big surprises. One, being the final decision maker with my name on the cases, and 2, being the public face of the office with my photograph in the story all the time. Being the final decision maker was a bigger change than I anticipated. In the past, I'd always tried to give the advice I would want to hear and to recommend only actions I'd be willing to take myself in my own name. But still, being the final decision maker made me want to ask more questions and be even more sure that the decision was sound and we thought of all the possible problems. Before, I'd been part of a team of advisors. Now the actions would be taken in my name. It's surprising how sobering that was. For example, soon after I took office, we needed to decide whether to file a case against Donald Trump and others on the board of the Trump Foundation, alleging mismanagement of the foundation funds in numerous respects, including use of the funds for personal and business purposes that the foundation was not allowed to serve. I was presented with a draft of the petition, the document that starts this kind of case, and it had the caption, "The People of the State of New York by Barbara D. Underwood, Attorney General of the State of New York against Donald Trump and others." And it took me by surprise, not the content, but the caption. It made me want to confirm one more time, not only the facts alleged, but also that we would have brought, sometimes against other charitable foundations with less political charge. By the way, I'm really glad I did. Weeks later, someone asked me at a public event, when are you going to stop doing political cases like the Trump Foundation case and get back to the job of regular law enforcement? And I could say with facts to back it up, this is regular law enforcement. On the evidence we have, the political action would be to kill the case, not to bring it. The other big surprise was being photographed all the time by journalists for stories about our work. That meant I had to pay a lot more attention to my hair and my clothes every day. And I quickly felt the need to expand my press-worthy wardrobe. especially after one publication described me as wearing the same blue suit she wore when she was sworn in as AG. I doubt that many men get called out for wearing the same suit too many times. So in the middle of all the activity arising from my new responsibilities, I spent a fair amount of time in those early weeks shopping for clothes. I wish my mother had survived a few more years to see all this publicity. During most of my career, when I called her attention to press clippings about cases I had worked on, she would ask, "But where is your name?" My answer, between the lines. In those years, my work was pretty well known to the legal community, but the public credit went mostly to the elected or politically appointed officials who led the offices. For the year I was Attorney General, my name was in the headlines and my picture was in the paper all the time. That year, a number of prominent men in various fields left their leadership roles and were replaced by women who had been their top advisors. Journalists began to comment on the phenomenon. Sometimes the transitions resulted from allegations of misconduct and sometimes from other causes like transfers of political power. When CNN's Christiane Amanpour interviewed me as AG, we briefly exchanged notes on the experience of replacing famous men. There are more women in leadership positions all the time, and we're now seeing a concerted effort by the president to increase the number of women and minorities on the courts and in leadership positions in government. This is a good thing for many reasons. People talk about providing opportunities for those worthy individuals and providing role models to inspire young people. But I'd like to talk about why it helps improve decision-making and the operations of the institutions involved. It's not because there's a single woman's point of view that will change outcomes, or a single point of view held by Blacks or by any other identifiable group. But there are some life experiences that women have, and other outsiders too, and those experiences can make a difference in decision-making. This issue has come up several times in court cases about discrimination in jury selection. In 1946, the Supreme Court said, 1946, the Supreme Court said, a flavor, a distinct quality is lost if either sex is excluded from the jury. In 1972, Justice Thurgood Marshall said something similar. He said, when any large and identifiable segment of the community is excluded from jury service, the effect is to remove from the jury room a perspective on human events that may have unsuspected importance in any case that may be presented. Justice Marshall was explaining why the exclusion of Blacks from juries was harmful not only to Black defendants, but to all defendants, and indeed to everyone. It was the distinctive experience and the distinctive perspective that mattered, not some predictable, distinctive vote. Justice Marshall knew, we all know, that women or Blacks or other identifiable groups don't always vote together, and they don't always favor the litigant who looks like them. But women and other groups too bring to decision-making a distinctive life experience, and then they each use it differently. For women, part of that shared experience is specifically female, and part of it is the experience of being different, of being the only woman in a room of men, like being the only Black person in a room of white people, and of needing to work especially hard to be heard and to be taken seriously. Justice Marshall understood the connection between race discrimination and sex discrimination, and he had no patience for either one. He was one of the first justices to hire a woman law clerk, and he insisted on writing his anti-discrimination opinions to condemn not only race discrimination, but sex discrimination as well. In fact, he said it was racist to think that Blacks were the only people who needed the protection of the anti-discrimination. It seems fitting that it was the first woman Supreme Court justice who made the point about perspectives rather than outcomes in her tribute to the first Black justice. After he left the court, Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor wrote that she would miss Thurgood Marshall at conferences because he brought a perspective shaped by his life experiences and he was constantly pushing and prodding the others to see what he saw. He not only changed the conferences he attended, but even the conferences that took place after he was gone. Justice O'Connor wrote, "Even now, I still catch myself looking expectantly for his raised brow and his twinkling eye, hoping to hear just one more story that would by and by perhaps change the way I see the world."
60 seconds.
Important challenges of our time to bring into the courts and the law firms, the boardrooms and the executive suites, in business and government, in the academy, and in all the institutions of our society, many different perspectives, so we can build the bridges that are needed to unite our large and diverse and deeply divided nation. I hope to keep working on that problem for some years to come. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very, very much, Barbara. We'll move right along to hopefully have some time at the end for some questions. Our next speaker is Harrison Young. Harrison gave up journalism and had a career as banker, an advisor to banks and governments, chief executive of China's first investment banking firm, a non-executive director of the biggest bank in Australia, where he now lives, and a member of the Court of Governors of the Bank of England. He has published 4 novels, quote, "love stories with the sex left in," unquote. And he is writing a nonfiction book about banks. We thank Harrison for getting up and being with us at 4:30 in the morning, his time.
If there are 600 people on a ferry and a school of porpoises appears and everyone rushes to the starboard side to see them, the ferry may capsize. Some people, knowing there are porpoises in the harbor, having gotten a sense of how the ferry handles the swell and observing the size of the crowd on deck, will get off at the next opportunity. Such individuals make good bankers. There are not enough of them. 50 years ago today, the 1st of June, 1971, I got on that ferry. I joined the First National City Bank as a trainee. It was an improvisation. I planned to go to law school when the Army was done with me, but I didn't get in. Never mind, I've had an interesting life. I've been a commercial banker and an investment banker and the things that Donna mentioned. And I have opinions. I also have the manuscript of that book about banking. It needs a publisher or at least an agent. I mention this in case any of you have grandchildren in those fields. For the next, I guess it's 99 minutes, I'm going to pretend you've become non-executive directors of a bank and that I've been asked to brief you on your new responsibilities. Here are some of the things I'd want to tell you. Banks are fragile. They lend long and borrow short. They are highly leveraged. The quality of their assets must be taken on faith. The more time that passes since the last scare, the more risk aversion drains out of people, institutions, and markets. There is no stable equilibrium. At some stage, a crisis is inevitable. Piloting a bank means being prepared for it. Given the scarcity of natural prudence, banks need rules. An unregulated banking system would be at the mercy of banker enthusiasm. Being regulated is part of the business model, same as having a lender of last resort is. Banks keep finding ways to get in trouble. Non-bankers might conclude that perfecting the rules is the answer. They would be wrong. What most often endangers banks is complacency. Rules can't prevent that, only culture can. Banks are public institutions. Joining a bank board makes you a public official. Please don't assume that I advocate nationalizing banks. Far from it. Government-owned banks almost always lose credit discipline. Many become insolvent. Banks run best as hybrid institutions, anchored in the private sector, but given enough support to be stable, comprehensively supervised, and conscious of their social obligations.
Harrison,
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. We've got some requests. Can you tip your camera down? We can only see half of your face. Yeah, terrific. Thank you so much.
I don't know if it'll stay there, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Well, managing risk calls for something akin to aesthetic judgment. This is not a matter of maximizing something, but of achieving balance. Society asks banks to take risk, but not too much. How much is that? The question begets a string of further questions. What risks are we taking now? How do we describe them? Can we measure them? How do we feel about them? Asking and answering such questions helps us find the point of balance. The understanding between banks and society is constantly being renegotiated. What guides those discussions is a sense of fairness. I use that word because it points in the right direction, but is somewhat vague. Fairness is imprecise. It isn't about correctness, but reasonableness. It's a quality of games and deals and situations that is desirable, but often absent. Human beings are born with unequal endowments of talent and persistence into societies and families and centuries of uncertain benevolence. It is easier to define or give examples of unfairness than its opposite. As we tell each other, life is unfair. Banks try not to be. Some people believe business enterprises, including banks, should not attempt to make fairness judgments, that their appropriate focus is value creation, and that outcomes delivered by markets are fair by definition. I disagree. The work of a bank board is as much political as financial. Directors must attend to the interests of all shareholders, including the general public, and devise compromises that leave everyone grudgingly acquiescent. A bank's mission includes a duty not to exploit its power advantage relative to its customers. This does not mean giving away all the value the bank creates. Directors must decide what is fair. If being both an advocate and an adjudicator gives a bank board a conflict of interest to manage, well, life is like that. Nothing exactly requires banks to care about fairness. They just do, or mostly do. Their business decisions reflect what they think is right and what they think the community thinks. In their dealings with management, non-executive directors are pulled in conflicting directions. Serving on a bank board is prestigious. You want to join the team and wear the t-shirt. At the same time, you know it is your job to be skeptical, to ask follow-up questions. If this makes you uncomfortable, you are probably a good director. The best tool boards have for tackling strings of risk questions, for deciding what is fair, and for overcoming the social awkwardness of their role is conversation. Conversation is a game without rules, an exchange of views that involves both talking and listening, that is both disciplined and open-ended. It means going back and forth over the same ground, clarifying your thinking by saying things in different ways. It enables us to manage things we can't measure. Conversation is what a board is for and why it is a group. To have good conversations, directors must respect each other and tolerate each other's idiosyncrasies. They must let one of their number tell those, quote, little stories that may not mean anything for no better reason than, quote, Mary has good radar. Insight makes its home in narrative. Storytelling takes time. Your chairman must understand that, but you mustn't let him bring debate to a conclusion. Much of what a smart non-executive chairman does is intermediate. For example, counseling the chief executive that filtering the information she sends to the board will backfire, and persuading directors who have had successful executive careers to give the CEO space to do her job. A chairman and a CEO need to get along, but they should not be buddies, nor should one person have both jobs. Finding the right non-executive chairman can be just as important as finding the right CEO, but it's not always clear how he or she gets chosen or what brings a reign to an end. Boards of public companies, including banks, exist because of the agency problem. Someone has to sit across the table from management and negotiate pay. Beyond that, a non-executive board traditionally had an undemanding oversight mandate. People would tell you that absent a crisis, hiring a good CEO was the board's entire job description. That may be true for non-financial enterprises, but it isn't for banks. Risk and fairness decisions benefit from the participation of a diverse group of non-executive directors with enough domain knowledge and emotional distance to challenge management's conclusions. Regulators are requiring boards to involve themselves more deeply in piloting their bank. The global financial system is absurdly dependent on a small number of shrewd, dedicated, under-rewarded prudential supervisors. Directors tend to view supervisors as the opposition. They ought to see them as partners. They contend with the same problem, after all, not knowing what's going on inside the bank. Banking is a craft that is almost a profession. We need to finish making it one. Both bankers and supervisors should be members, just as barristers and judges are both members of the legal profession. A career path that leads to a senior job in either a bank or a supervisory agency should include a 2 or 3 year secondment to the other wing of the profession. One difficulty with cross postings is the difference in compensation. Many bankers are paid too much. Some supervisors should be paid more. A unified profession could have the collateral benefit of addressing these disparities. Boards justify high pay for executives by tying it to shareholder return. What a massive potential payoff tends to motivate is increased effort and risk-taking. In banking, trying too hard is generally a mistake. If your remuneration model allows driven 30-year-olds to receive $5 million bonuses, you will employ the wrong 30-year-olds. A better approach might be to emulate the military or the public service, to create a work environment and reward structure that attract the sort of people you want. Self-motivated, proud of their skills, and appropriately reflective. I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Harrison. Our third presenter, Marian Bennett. Marian C. Bennett grew up in Minneapolis. White law firms in Chicago would not hire her father after he graduated from the University of Chicago Law School because they did not think their clients were quote unquote ready for a quote unquote Negro attorney. Growing up in an activist family, Marian picketed Woolworths in Minneapolis in support of sit-in demonstrations in the South. In the summer of 1965, while helping Blacks register to vote in Charleston, South Carolina, she spent the 4th of July in jail after quote unquote trespassing on a public beach that had been closed to avoid compliance with a court order to integrate. After 35 plus years as an attorney in the federal government, 2 marriages, 2 children, 2 grandchildren, and a great-grandson, Marian spends part of the year in Pensacola, Florida, continuing her political activist work, and especially working to replace her congressional representative, Matt Gaetz.
Good afternoon. A few months ago, the pastor of the church I attend here in Pensacola made a comment that absolutely shocked me. He said, African Americans are in an abusive relationship with this country. I was really shocked because after 77 plus years, I had words to describe what I've lived through. And suddenly, so much made perfect sense. I was also shocked because I now had the words not only to describe what whites have done to Blacks and other minority groups, but to describe how African Americans have responded. So first, a disclaimer. I have never been in an abusive relationship with another individual, other than the occasional demonic supervisor or deranged colleague that you had to help do their work. I have had a couple of friends in abusive relationships, and I was able to help them out of those circumstances. So I want to first thank those friends who, when they read the title of my talk, reached out to me to offer support and comfort, or who just offered to listen. So Annette, Alice, Rona, Emily, I'll try to address your concerns at the end. What are the characteristics of an abusive relationship? Well, first, I learned that there are more than just abusive domestic relationships. There can be abusive economic and financial relationships as well. An abuser will threaten the victim with weapons. And as I read these characteristics, I jotted down the ones that I thought most applied to the relationship that African Americans have had with this country. The abuser will hurt the victim physically. The abuser will inflict sexual abuse, rape, or forced sexual activity. The abuser withholds resources, essential resources, from the victim: food, money, clothing, shelter. The abuser uses religious beliefs to justify dominating and controlling the victim. The abuser cuts the victim off from family and friends. And we can just imagine what happened when Africans were brought from Africa, and imagine the selling and separating of families during slavery. And in modern times, some welfare or relief programs require that the husband not be in the household for the family to qualify for assistance. The abuser doesn't allow the victim to have a job. What about all those employment ads that said Negroes need not apply, or the job was for whites only? That was years and years ago. But even today, studies show that when 2 resumes and 2 applications are submitted for the same job, and 1 applicant is clearly of color, that applicant will not get the job. The abuser sees the victim as property or as a sexual object. When I was doing some family research, or trying to, it was astonishing to me that the only time from slave period that you would find African Americans listed would be if the estate had been inventoried and slaves were listed with the property and the livestock. The abuser destroys the victim's property. Tulsa, Black churches, Black homes destroyed when Black families move into white neighborhoods. The abuser tells the victim that the situation is the victim's fault. The abuser threatens to abuse the victim's family members or their children. And when I was reading one book, it was probably by Isabel Wilkerson, I learned that when Blacks tried to leave the South after the First World War, they were threatened by the owners of the farms where they worked. They were threatened that their families would be thrown off the farms if they left, and they sometimes were even beat up themselves. The abuser humiliates the victim in front of others. The abuser controls the victim. There would be some good periods in the relationship, and then an explosion and abuse. In looking into this subject, the thing that really shocked me and hurt me as much as anything was to look at the excuses that victims in an abusive relationship make for staying in the relationship. Well, the abuser apologized. The abuser says it won't happen again. The victim might say, I can't leave because of the children, other family members, friends I love, my job, the house. And then these following ones really hurt the most. The victim might say, I can stand it. It doesn't bother me that much. If I just stick it out, things will change. Things will get better. He isn't that way all the time. I am hopeful that things will get better. I spoke with a friend who's a counselor, and I said, what kind of advice do you give a victim in an abusive relationship? The counselor tells the victim to realize and to accept the fact that the victim is not responsible for the abuse. The victim is not responsible for the abuser's actions. So African Americans, to start, didn't ask to be chained and put into the holds of slave ships. The next piece of advice might be to disengage from the relationship, to set personal boundaries, develop an escape strategy, a safe place, identify a safe place to shelter, somehow break the cycle. And this one really got me. Somehow exit the relationship or circumstance. If possible, cut all ties, make clear that the relationship is over and don't look back. Give yourself time to heal, find a therapist. Don't delude yourself about the reality of the situation. and devise a method of coping with the situation that works best for you. The other thing that startled me when I was looking into the issue of domestic relationships and the abuse that sometimes occurs is when friends, European American friends in the past 2-3 years said to me, I don't know how you can stand this day after day. How have you been able to put up with this all these years? And some would even say, why do you put up with this year after year? Unfortunately, the answer goes back to the excuses and the accommodations that victims make. So I was really touched and moved by the reaching out from classmates who thought that I was in an abusive relationship. Specifically, Rona asked me, why did I wait until now to discuss this? And all I can say is, this is the first time I've really thought of putting that relationship in these terms. Emily told me she was so glad that I was out of this abusive relationship. But Emily, I'm not, and I don't really know how I can be. So that is my conundrum. That is my reality. And thank you for listening.
And thank you for presenting. Everybody's doing so well on time. I've not had to use the hook yet. Our next presenter is David Ruth. David served on a nuclear submarine after graduation, and then spent 4 years studying social psychology at Harvard-GSAS. He dropped out to spend 5 years living on a commune in rural Virginia, and then began working to help people with disabilities obtain employment. He developed software for the Social Security Administration designed to help those getting jobs to navigate the Social Security system without losing their benefits before they've earned enough to be self-supporting. Since the early 80s, he has been teaching Tai Chi as his avocation.
When Sandy Unger asked me to give a 10-minute speech based on my entry in the 55th annual report, he said that I had written about finding the Trump years a challenge to my Taoist philosophy. I agreed to give this speech, even though I could not remember anything that I'd written. When I later searched my computer, I could not find a copy of my report. So when the annual report arrived a few weeks ago, I was both surprised and mortified by what I had dashed off. Here is what I said. The last 5 years have been a real test of the Taoist philosophy that has informed my way of being in the world as I've dived more deeply into the spiritual and ethical teachings of Taoism. Accepting reality as it is in the Trump era without succumbing to rage or despair has been a challenge. The idea that I should not despise the Trump sycophants who enable our president is most difficult to accept. I can only hope that they learn that the path they've chosen will not lead to the ends they hope to achieve. To explain my mortification, I need first to tell you about aspects of my history with and current understanding of Taoism. A few of you may remember that during my undergraduate years, I studied and taught Uechi-ryu karate through the Harvard Karate Club. I studied, my first teacher was Will Zachman, class of '64. As he taught it, Uechi-ryu was a peaceful style, emphasizing graceful movements and a peaceful approach to conflict resolution. When after a stint in the Navy, I returned for graduate studies, I found that Will had switched to teaching Taiji Chuan, an even more peaceful martial art. So I switched too. An essential principle of Taiji is to never meet force with force, both literally and metaphorically. Taiji players yield, deflect, get out of the way, and only issue force when it neutralizes an attack. I was told by later Taiji teachers that this and other aspects of Taiji were rooted in the philosophy of Taoism. When I first began exploring those roots, however, I found myself perplexed, both by the seemingly impenetrable text of the main book of Taoist teachings, the Tao Te Ching, as well as by New Age myths and misinterpretations. It was not until early this century that I discovered Derek Lin's translation of the Tao Te Ching and his book of 365 essays called The Tao of Joy. Lin argues that much of the confusion about Taoism is a result of mistranslations of the Chinese term Wu Wei. Quoting from the Tao of Joy, the character Wu in this context means not having. The character Wei means action or purpose. Together, these two characters have often been translated as non-doing or non-action, but the real meaning goes much deeper. Wu Wei does not mean passivity, apathy, or indifference. Instead, Wu Wei is about acting without attachments, so one can focus on the action itself without expectations of particular results. When you are in the Wu Wei state, you exhibit effortless efficiency. You deliver only the most appropriate action in the most efficient way and nothing more. Sometimes this means simply letting things be. Other times it means engaging in actions that are swift and effective, but also gentle and minimally intrusive. The New Age myth about Taoism is that it says we should accept reality as it is and go with the flow. That is, we should passively accept reality and do nothing to change things. Lin says, however, that Tao sages, when in contentious situations, are as alert and calm as the Taiji master facing a charging opponent. They exhibit a confident command as they guide and channel the destructive energies away from themselves. Effective Taoists, therefore, accept reality calmly and act in the most efficient way possible to change reality to be more in accord with their understanding of the Tao. The most important concept here is the acceptance of reality calmly, without rage. Taoists believe that anger and other strong emotions cloud our thinking and make it difficult to act effectively. As a student of Taiji, I've been learning and practicing for the past 48 years how to move most efficiently and effectively. As a student of Taoism for the past 10 or so years, I've been trying to learn how to think and act in the world most efficiently and effectively. I'm not, therefore, mortified by this sentence in my contribution to the annual report. Accepting reality as it is in the Trump era without succumbing to rage or despair has been a challenge. I'm sad that I felt powerless to have much of an effect in the Trump reality, but I'm not ashamed to feel challenged by that powerlessness, nor at times to fall somewhat short of my Taoist aspirations. What I am ashamed of is having written about despising Trump's sycophants. Taoists recognize that all of us travel along different paths. Some paths may be objectively better than others, but it is not our job to issue statements that categorize and make judgments about others' paths. Taoists simply observe others' actions and observe the results of those actions. Just as Taiji masters would never initiate a fight, true Taoists would never opine unbidden about contentious issues. Taoists do try to learn about the reasons others make the decisions they make, but we reveal our own reasoning only if those others ask for our thoughts. By labeling a whole class of others as sycophants, I made public judgments about their motivations, and I possibly instigated a fight. So I apologize to any of you who I may have offended with my contribution to the 55th annual report. And I hope that in the past year, I have progressed enough in my adherence to Taoist principles to act more efficiently and effectively. I'd like to end this speech with a 2-minute video showing a solo movement in the form I teach and a brief demonstration of Tai Chi push hands, a gentle semi-choreographed form of sparring. This was an unrehearsed single take video, and you should bear in mind that we had a COVID year off in working together until a few weeks ago. Cue the video. All right, I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of the solo form. This is a movement called Grass Sparrow's Tail, and it consists of 4 movements. Ward off, roll back, press, and push. Now these 4 movements are the 4 movements that are used in what's called the manipulation in the two-person Tai Chi that's called push hands. Margaret and I are going to show that. All right, so she's doing press, roll back, ward off, push. And we're doing this very gentle thing together. Now I'm going to do something that a Tai Chi master would not do except in push hands. And that's that I'm going to initiate attack. And Margaret, don't do any kind of counter for this one. So I'm going to do an attack that's this. All right, that's the attack I'm going to do. Now, Margaret is going to do the defense from this attack this time. No, she's not.
Oh, I'm confused.
Let's do it again.
Sorry.
Let's do it again. Here we get this attack, and she turns it, and that's the. But I then can do this and turn it also into an attack. Thank you. And that's it.
Thank you, David. And now we come to our last 10-minute talk. Noel Solomons. Noel, like me, a native of Cambridge, townie turned gownie, those are his words, was my classmate for our high school and college years. At Harvard, he was the coordinator of CRCC, the Harvard Civil Rights Coordinating Committee. Based in Guatemala since 1975, he is the founder and scientific director of the Center for Studies of Sensory Impairment, Aging and Metabolism. His efforts for social justice, both within the US and abroad, leave him bemused with an expatriate's perspective on our current social and political times. All yours, Noel.
Thank you,
No.
Donna.
Okay.
And you've seen the title, so let me get on to my image. The 1619 arrival of the slaves, called the original sin of the American experiment. And it's affected my life from my birth to going to Guatemala as a victim, from the time in Guatemala as aspiring to be an ally, and then in the recent years as described as a bemused onlooker. For those who would like labels to put around those social movements of my times, this would be a good display. But most importantly, social movements themselves have a morphology, have an anatomy. They're based on protests in the streets, organization in the communities, and words. words that can be written, spoken, or even sung. And to the apologies of the drifters from our freshman year, the sodium vapor lamps are bright on Broadway. That would be Broadway, Cambridge, where I studied K to 8 at the Longfellow School, then moved up with Donna and the rest of our classmates to the Cambridge High in Latin, eventually winding up at the Harvard Square fire station, crossing over into the yard, and being embraced by Harvard and embracing the civil rights movement of the 1960s, which was basically about equal access gained by nonviolent terms. This is the sit-in Greensboro, North Carolina, and to the right, of course, is the confrontation in Selma. It really tested the philosophy of nonviolence. But as Dick Gregory would say, I don't want to marry your sister. I just want you to get your foot off my neck. And my real pride in the movement was to be an 18-year-old bus captain in the New England delegation to the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, where following Celtic Bill Russell down to the steps of the memorial, we listened to Martin, tell us about your dream. And then in the weeks after the Selma debacle, I was part of a group of university activists in Boston who staged a sit-in in the top of the federal building in order to get federal protection for the marchers in Montgomery. And we were unceremoniously dragged out and deposited on Federal Street. And from that time in Boston, we would find me at protests and at activities at the Boston Common and elsewhere. Now the community action, the epitome, was the Black Panther Party. You can see their logo on the left, and many of you streaming this summer at home in quarantine have seen the award-winning film, Judas and the Black Messiah, the story of the life and the death of Fred Hampton. And for me, with his notes of a native son and the fire next time, James Baldwin wins my award of the Thomas Paine polemic of the civil rights movement. But the Black street corner and the Black church were strongly abhorrent of homosexuality. And for that reason, he did not have the impact on the movement that he should have. And this is another federal building, one in Washington, D.C., where in the summer of 1965, I was supposed to have been an intern on the 7th floor in the Office of Science. But having just been dragged out of a sibling building in Boston, I did not get a top secret security clearance and was relegated to the Agency for International Development, which represented the epiphany of my life, because there is where I learned about public health nutrition. And with it, I shifted my focus from basic science to the medical sciences, where I would spend another 4 years on another Harvard campus, active with the Medical Committee for Human Rights and the Student Health Organization. And so anxious was I to see an actual malnourished child that I went to Peru the next summer and worked in a pediatric research hospital. And I told my host I was going to Huancayo, which is the highest open air market in the world, 4,000 meters in the Andes. And they said, Noel, have you been tested for sickle cell trait? If not, you might have a sickle cell crisis when you reach the altitude. So as I rode up the train to that altitude, waiting for my spleen to erupt and infarct at any moment, I realized that my host could see me. They saw that I was Black, I was different. This had consequences, but they never saw it as inferiority. And the second epiphany was that I would separate myself and become an expat. I would leave the abuser, in Marian's terms. But for the years after medical school were intensive hospital training, where every day is a Groundhog's Day, and I put my activism into full hibernation. And the next time it would see its shadow would be in the sunlight of this beautiful country of Guatemala, where I would be working at the Institute of Nutrition of Central America in Panama, a place that had one single doctoral level professional, and she was the director of the dietetics school. And dietetics was the profession that women taught because they couldn't get into the National Medical School. And on February 4th of 1976, a devastating earthquake that took the lives of 30,000 people and shattered the lives of 5 to 10 times many occurred. And I got back into my clinical doctor role and went up to a Red Cross aid station in the town of San Juan Zacatepeques, where I would meet the most amazing woman of my life, the young indigenous activist, Celia Chet York, who had worked for the mayor of the city, but since the city hall lay in ruins, I offered her a job working with me back at INCAP. And she learned fast, and she was inspired to enter the National University in chemistry, where she in turn would meet Felipe Relac, and they would fall in love and have a child, Jose Felipe Relac Chet, who they asked me to be his godfather. And I accepted, along with her sister, Isabel York, and we were the grandparents. And one night in 1983, they left Jose off for care and went off to a meeting, and Celia's body, her remains, have never been seen again. Now, with regard to the support of women, CESIUM was founded in July of 1985, and coincidentally, the first private college medical student school had its first graduation in the next year, and it had admitted more than half of its students as women. So the graduates, the new physicians, were women. But the word was out in Guatemala City that those women had no reason to apply for medical residencies because they would not be accepted. They were expected to go back to some home or family and have children. So I had at my disposal the best and the brightest of talent, and they became researchers with me. Today, one of those women has an independent laboratory in NIH, and another is an assistant associate provost at Northeastern University in Boston. 7 of the 8 that I've supported to go abroad for PhDs have been women. 9 of the 11 who come to Guatemala to do research have been women. 3 out of 4 of the students that come for the summer have been women, and this is my team in the highlands of Guatemala. We try and do research that's relevant also to these groups. The Guatemalan Mayans are the shortest people in the world, and we've tried to look at the origins and the consequences of the shortness. And Guatemalan children take breast milk up to 3 years of life, and we've looked at the quality of the breast milk, and of the 17 nutrients you see listed either in the paper title or below, we found unfortunately 13 are lacking in full concentration.
60 seconds, Noel.
Well, this is my final slide. This is born to us during the pandemic, has been a blessing. The great niece of Celia Chet, who unfortunately will never be able to see her great aunt. And thank you.
Thank you. Well, that actually concludes our 10-minute talks for today. You'll notice from the program that there are going to be another series of 10-minute talks on Thursday afternoon, which Charlie Rosansky will be moderating. First of all, I want to thank every single one of you for an absolutely astounding presentation. I've been enthralled and felt terrible every single time I had to look at my timer and use the hook. I also want to thank Ann and Sandy for plucking you out of the Red Book and encouraging you to produce what you produced. They worked, Sandy and Ann worked very, very hard on this. And I wanted everybody to give us a big round of applause for all that went forward today.